Yeah, I think like the first thing is that you know I used to work in an oral history center at the University of South Dakota, and so I used to sit at a reel to reel machine and just digitize reel to reels from it's considered the largest oral history collection in North America of indigenous oral histories. And it's at this like little it was in the basement, kind of like how we started off. It was in the basement of this place called Dakota Hall. It's like literally naming like a hall MLK Hall, but then putting all of his archives in the basement. You know, it's like it was that kind of like level of institutional racism. But I was going through all of those, reel to reels, and I would just sit and listen to them. And there was some amazing story. Actually, there was an interview with my one of my grandmothers was in it, and
And you just stumbled across it one day?
yeah, and
Wow.
it's not like it's great stuff, but it's this is the thing is that they had the hardware to do these things. They went to they went to the Wounded Knee occupation. They went around when the American Indian movement was active, but these were like white interviewers. These were white ethnographers, and they had an agenda in mind, and they weren't welcome. Like people didn't really want to sit down with them. A lot of the times we found that the interviews that they had conducted were often without like written consent. So there was a lot of ethical issues. And this is like I'm making a larger point here because it's like it's about hardware and software, right? In the sense that they had the hardware, they had the reel-to-reel recorders, they were like updating, the system, or they were digitizing everything, but the software wasn't there in the sense that like these interviews were often extractive. And it made me think about my own kind of research as an oral historian. Like, how do you actually conduct an interview? And so I just began to do what would be considered like beat reporting and doing interviews and recording people with their consent, but also learning to tell stories more so in the written form, because interview is like a whole craft. It requires a level of listening and engagement that is really difficult. And this is a long explanation, so bear with me because I think this is something that I teach students and that I teach that I hope hopefully taught some of the other kind of like co-hosts. And as I've learned throughout this process is that it does take active listening, and you can have we're recording right now on these really amazing Shure mics, but we also are recording on an iPhone, and everyone has an iPhone, and you can actually record a podcast on an iPhone, and I have recorded a podcast on an iPhone. Why? Because sometimes when you stick a big mic like this, or stick this HD camera in somebody's face, they act different. But an iPhone, what I realize is with an iPhone, they're so common. Like phones are so common, but now they have great recording equipment that people just kind of relax, like they're having a conversation with you. And that's really the kind of art of an interview: is how do you get somebody to sit down and like really open up to you? Because when you're talking to dignitaries, when you're talking to politicians, when you're talking to everyday people, activists, they have a script, that they follow. They have, an objective, but it's really about how do you like peel back those layers. And I think it requires multiple levels of engagement. One is like, like Jorge Ariasa.
I was just thinking about him. You read my mind.
Yeah, he's a friend of mine.
Yeah.
No, he's a friend.
Warm, such a warm guy. Like just from his interview, you could tell.
And if you see other interviews with him, he's a little bit more like more of a I mean, he's very dignified in the interview. Yeah, but he like lets his guard down because he and I have spoken off the record. Just talked about things. He helped he invited me to the southern region of Bolivar, where I got to sit down with indigenous people who were talking about what the Bolivarian Revolution meant to them, and the contradictions of that Bolivarian process, and like how it affected them, how sanctions affected them. And it was a fascinating experience because on one hand, it wasn't like they were trying to hide anything from me. Jorge Arias, he's like, I know there's problems down there, and you should listen to what those problems are. It'll help you understand, this region better. And they were, it wasn't like everyone was like flag waving, rah, rah, rah for the Bolivarian Revolution. They were for the Bolivarian Revolution, but in terms of the state, they were like, we have some criticisms and legitimate criticisms. But he was very open and candid about that. And you don't really get that in terms of like a White House press briefing, or when you're sitting down even with a politician, they're going to give you something that you want to hear, right? And I think that's the thing. There's a dialectical relationship in terms of the interviewer and the interviewee, because it means that the things that you're presenting, you're throwing something out in the world, but you're showing that it's in process, it's in struggle. And I think that's what people forget about revolutions, is that they're not one-time events. Like, this is a long, drawn-out process. And ask yourself, why haven't you heard anything about Venezuela in the news recently? It's because things are actually kind of going good there. And so when things are going good, nobody pays attention. But when they're in crisis, everybody has to weigh in, and they want to, moralize. And I think the same, goes with Bolivia. Like, Bolivia was such a model for me, because it's like, when you don't hear news out of Bolivia, it's probably a good thing, because things are stabilizing, or, there's a revolution underway that takes, decades to unfold. And they're not stupid people. They know that they know the contradictions, they know all those kinds of things. And I think that's what, it takes that level of humility and, just sincerity to understand that these are real processes, that these are real stakes underway, to understand like how one maybe conducts an interview, to say like, can you as an activist or an organizer sit down with somebody that you may politically disagree with and actually listen to them? Because I learned that in union, when we organized a union at the university that I used to work at, is that I had all these colleagues like politically would never sit down, never socially sit down with them. They were like the most reactionary people ever in the world. But when you listen to like how they complained about work or the grievances that they had at work, you understood it's like, actually, I have that grievance too. So we can relate on that kind of level. And I think that's the kind of active listening that you learn through the process of conducting interviews. And all it takes really is to just have a conversation. And there's books written on oral history methodologies and this and that. And it's like, that's great. If you're learning, you should really check those out, but also just talk to people with the consciousness that it's not just you are the only one listening, that there's an audience there. Right. And I think that's the one thing that I think is different about our podcast and the way that we do interviews, because there is an inbuilt kind of indigenous methodology. Like when one, sits down, at a campfire and somebody's telling an oral history about like the origins of the Ochete Xalcoy or the origins of the Huichacpi Oyate, like there's been so many times when, you sit down and like everyone knows the story and they all tell it together. And it's like, it's the coolest thing in the world, because in, Western academia, it's all textual. And, you have your citation.
It's formally rigid.
And
essay form.
Yeah, and it's individualistic.
Hypothesis. It's like the scientific method takes over, not. Yeah.
And so in the oral history tradition that we have, like even if you go back to a book like Black Elk Speak, and I use this often because it's one of the most famous kind of quote unquote oral histories of an indigenous person in North America. And he's he's a very well-known, well-respected individual, but that's not actually his quote unquote soul story. He actually, when he did those interviews with this poet, John Neidhart, he sat with 5 other guys, who were like telling the story alongside with him, telling the story of the Fetterman fight, telling the story of the Battle of Little Bighorn, because Nicholas Black Elk knew that he wasn't the sole, like, receptacle of memory or remembrance, that there was a collective history. And so it'd actually be irresponsible for him to just be like, this is my story. And so they would like correct him in real time. It was like citational practice in real time. And that's the kind of dynamism of indigenous oral histories, is that it's a collective memory. It's not like one individual can remember, the entire treaty of 1868. It's that collectively we understand that this is how our knowledge systems work. And I think what Red Nation podcast has done is kind of sort of exemplified or given a taste. Like we just scratched the surface. Like there are so many, and you and I were talking about this, there are so many killed episodes that we've had for a variety of reasons. Maybe our fault, maybe like not knowing how to record properly, or like the content was, like for example, like there was this really beautiful episode we were trying to put together on Monoman. We did one episode on Monoman, the wild rice harvesting, but
Early episode, possibly.
yeah, it was like the second or third episode we did. But then we were doing another one, and it took place in northern Minnesota, but the person who we interviewed was like being persecuted by the state, and so we couldn't actually and there was a legal case going on, so we couldn't actually publish what she was portraying in it. But it was a beautiful, nonetheless, learned a lot of stuff, and hopefully but that's the kind of practice that you have, the ethical responsibility you have with an interview, in an interview, quote unquote subject, is like, this story doesn't just belong to you, it's like it belongs to the movement, and it also belongs to that community.